Hey boys, Mr. Fordham here. As I believe it, you're about to start a new unit of work. In this unit, you're going to be looking at a badminton training program, participating in that, critiquing that. And an important part of understanding sport as a whole is not just the physical aspects of it, but there's a lot of sport places itself in society as a significant contributor. Um, and to understand its impact on society, we have to apply some what we refer to as sociological concepts, or in your units of work, they'll be referred to as socio-cultural concepts. Um, but essentially, it's just looking at the study of sociology and looking at sport through that lens and looking at how sport impacts our society, how it impacts us as individuals when we participate in it, and how we impact the way sport is organised and run and experienced around the world. So you will have to look at some sociology aspects going forward, and a key part of that is understanding a little bit about, I suppose, how society is constructed. Because if you think about society, or we call it social construction, there are lots of rules which we abide by, and we develop these over time, whether you learn these traditions and practices from your parents, whether you learn it whilst you're at school, whether you learn how to behave, how to act through your different experiences, what's right, what's wrong, whether they are rules which are put in place by the government, laws, legal aspects, or whether they're just expectations on us as members of society. We can see that society is organized and structured in a way that it works. And that just doesn't happen. That's happened over a lot of time since the start, since society's existence. And all these rules and practices and traditions develop over time and continue to develop and reflect the time we are living in. So I just want to, you'll just see up the top here, I've just put some sort of key points or key words and ideas that you guys are going to need to be aware of as you move through the next unit of work, and when you start to critique sport through looking at sociological concepts. These are going to help, and we'll maybe do a couple more of these around a couple of other areas, but today we're focusing mostly on this concept which we refer to as cultural hegemony, and you'll see it there. I've highlighted it. I'm not sure if that's a pink color, maybe, I suppose. Now, just moving up that list there, I've already sort of touched on sociology and touched a little bit on social construction. And I suppose it's in the word there, construction, is that society has been constructed over time to reflect the expectations and traditions and practices of those times. And you'll see that society now is structured in a very different way than it used to be, say, 200, 300, 400 years ago. That's because the expectations and requirements of society have changed. And as the world continues to change, so will the construction of society and the way in which society moves and acts and is living in the world. So we have, lots of ideas in that. It's a big melting pot of theories and concepts to understand it. But Karl Marx, I'm sure you've heard of Marxist theories. He was a philosopher in the 1800s, and he was actually an economist, but he did do a lot of work around sociology, and he was what we refer to as a sociologist, and tried to devise theories to understand how society is constructed over time. And one of his key theories that he developed was this concept of cultural hegemony. Now, you may not have used or heard of the word hegemony, so I suppose the reason for me doing this video is just for you to understand a little bit about it so you can use it in your writing when you are critiquing sport from a sociological perspective. So cultural hegemony was a theory developed by Karl Marx to try and understand how societies are constructed and how people know how to act in society. So I've said below there, it's accepted and celebrated norms, practices, expectations, values, and traditions. And those are two quite key words: accepted and celebrated. And you'll see in sport all the time that we have accepted and celebrated norms, or accepted and celebrated practices, ways in which we act. And you do that through many different ways. And if we move to the next line down, for social construction now, and what we refer to as the modern era, it happens globally. It happens quite easily because access to information has improved so much over the past 30, 40 years. So there's two key concepts there, which are written down as globalization and mass media, to understand this whole picture of cultural hegemony. And globalization is a concept which refers to the modern era and the fact that the world is really, really connected now. Even through travel is a good point to look at. Only 50, 60 years ago, travel was mostly by ship, by boat. So that way, information traveled around the world in a very different manner. It was much slower. It was much more broken. Accessibility to information was only through major channels, major sources. So therefore, it was limited, and it meant that whoever was producing that information to be shared around the world could filter what they wanted the world to see and what they wanted the world not to see. Whereas you guys know now from your experience, if you want to find out something about a particular topic, your access to information is almost endless. If you've got time, you've definitely got the resources to find out what you want to find out. And you can find out lots of different perspectives on one particular topic. If you look at our current situation around COVID-19, we historically, when we're talking 100 years ago, the information coming out about COVID-19 would have been 100% controlled by the government. There wouldn't have been a lot of other information leaked to the rest of the world other than what the government decided it would be saying. Whereas now we can find out people's personal opinions, we can read blogs, we can go on Facebook, we can look at photo evidence, we can have access to journalism, which might not be through big media channels. So we can develop our own perspectives and our own understandings and knowledge from the research that we do, and we have access to a lot of information. And so that's what globalization is. It's meaning that across the world, the whole world, we are far more connected. And as a result of that, it means we can shape our societies, our local societies, on what is happening around the world. Whereas previously, before what we class as the modern era, that information wasn't readily available. So societies were very different in the way that they were constructed all around the world. Whereas we're now seeing a normalizing of society through globalization and the fact that the world is really, really connected. Second to that is mass media, and it ties in with globalization. And it's that that media is now readily accessible for everyone. And again, it just means that there's more standardizing of experience. It means that the messaging shared internationally is more standardized, and it's not individualized country by country or societal group by societal group. And a result of having those two things in play now with the modern era, and if we're looking through a sport context, it means that there's an avenue to reinforce all of these hegemonic norms. And I know that might seem like a strange set of words, hegemonic norms, but they are the accepted practices in sport. Okay, and so if we just look at rugby, is a really good context to look at the concept of cultural hegemony in, because something that's celebrated in rugby is the male icon, that strong, muscular, masculine man who has no fear, likes to really go into the fight, hit the tackles really hard, get hurt and keep on going. Those sorts of norms and practices and traditions and things that we value about being a rugby player in New Zealand. And so through mass media and globalization and mass media sort of is creating or driving society, its views on what we should value and shouldn't value, we're seeing that that's becoming more and more celebrated. This ultimate male, if you like, big, strong, deep voice, can grow a beard, muscular, really resilient, type of male. And that's what we would say are the accepted norms of and values of a male rugby player in New Zealand. And because in New Zealand rugby is such a significant part of society, particularly in the sporting realm, that almost carries into what we accept to be normal for a man living in New Zealand. If we look at the Kiwi bloke, and I think your teachers will ask you to do a task around the Kiwi bloke and write down what you think, what stereotypical characteristics a Kiwi bloke has. And you'll find that a lot of them relate quite closely to what we would celebrate in a rugby setting. And that's because rugby is so deeply embedded in our culture. So what cultural hegemony is almost like a lens. And if you put on a blue lens on a camera and you take a photo, everything's going to come out slightly blue. Well, if you look at society through a cultural hegemonic lens, what you're trying to do is try to identify all the norms, all the traditions, all the practices that we celebrate and accept as normal in our society. And that can heavily impact the way that we experience sport. And I'll paint a picture for you. Say you're in a core PE lesson at Rosmini College and you're going to play some multi-sport, and the teacher says, okay, you guys can self-sort your teams. You pick your own teams. So you're a captain, pick one side at a time. You can pick one player at a time. And you'll know that it's always the same boys who will be selected. And that doesn't necessarily relate to sporting performance, because if you were going to select those teams and want to be the best team, you would want to pick the best players. Often we see that it's not necessarily the best players who are selected. It's the guys in society who might be celebrated as being closest to what we expect to be the norms and celebrated way of society. The celebrated body type, the celebrated strength, the celebrated characteristics attached to the Kiwi bloke, those are the guys who will typically be selected. And that little team selecting time, that's quite a strong reflection of what happens in society. Not in all cases, but it is often a strong reflection of the way things work. And if you think about the experience of the person who's picked last, they're often the ones who are possibly marginalized from sport. So they feel like they shouldn't participate. There's a lot of barriers for them to participate. They might feel like they are not going to be valued because they can't do all of the things which we are going to celebrate in succeeding in that sport. So their experience of sport is going to be very different to the people who are selected first in those teams. And that's just one simple little example. If we look at PE as a whole at Rosmini College, we typically celebrate that, what we would call the masculine male. And that's just a historically embedded thing. Whether it's right or wrong, we know that in sports participation in New Zealand, if you're a male, that is going to be the celebrated norm. The hegemonic norm is the masculine male, the big, strong, fast male. And we can see quite clearly from this discussion that that can have a lot of impact on the way that we participate. Whether we are the big, strong, fast male, it will affect the way we participate. It might be a really positive effect. And whether we're not the big, strong, fast male, that might marginalize us from participating in sport and push us away from participating in sport and have a negative effect on our experience. And there's a spectrum there, and there's different reasons why people experience sport differently, but we can see that the way that we structure society, social construction, looking at cultural hegemony and the norms and practices and traditions of society that we celebrate is going to affect the way that people experience sport. Now, you're going to be looking at badminton, and badminton is not a sport which would be listed as a major populous participation sport in New Zealand. Typically, you're looking at football number one because it's it'll have high levels of participation across both genders. We now know that netball, basketball, and rugby are probably the top four. Rugby being fourth, basketball third, currently in the secondary school space, and netball in second. And badminton will be a long way down that list because it's not something that New Zealanders typically associate with. Well, if we look at, again, if we're talking about a lens and we put that lens on and we look at that issue of participation with badminton and our experience with badminton as New Zealanders, well, can we identify some aspects of cultural hegemony, some hegemonic norms, some accepted and celebrated norms, practices, traditions, expectations of participation in sport in New Zealand, and then start to look at why badminton participation is low? Maybe you guys can ask yourselves the question of who would we typically expect to be participating in badminton? Because badminton isn't necessarily celebrated as a sport in New Zealand, does that affect whether our interest levels of being participating in badminton or not? When we do participate in badminton at Rosamini College, and there might be an APD for one of your lessons, what is our experience going to be of that? Do we go there with a predisposition that we're not going to enjoy it because it's not a sport that we typically value in New Zealand society? It's not a cultural aspect of our society that we celebrate. Or will we really enjoy it? Because typically we are often marginalised from sports participation. This is something that's going to be a bit of a leveller, and we're not going to have those connotations of the strong, fast, big, masculine male, because those aren't things which are celebrated as part of the sport badminton. So maybe for some people, this might be a really positive experience. So you can see that if you look at sport through a social lens, there are lots of complications, and it can have a really significant impact on the way that we experience sport. And some key drivers for that are what I said earlier: globalization and mass media, and the way that that sport is presented to us. So just a few ideas there, guys, to get you thinking about this concept of cultural hegemony. The concept, just on reflection, the concept of cultural hegemony outlines that in society we have a set of values and expectations and norms which we attach to different aspects of society. And for example, in rugby, the celebrated hegemonic norm would be a big, strong, fast, angry, gruff, resilient male. But we know if we went into other aspects of sport that those hegemonic norms would change. Our expectations and what is celebrated would change. And that heavily affects the way that we participate and our experience of different sports and sporting experiences. So just something to think about. Sociology can be a little bit confusing. It's a bit airy-fairy. It is reflective of each individual's experiences in different areas. So your answers to particular questions with regards to sociology might be slightly different to the person next to you. That's because your experiences, your upbringing, your knowledge in this area is different than the person next to you. So it can be a good way to develop some healthy conversations, some healthy debates about how we participate and experience in sport. And that's why it's going to be an important part of this next unit of work. So this video may be useful, maybe not, but I will do another one on social discourse because I do think that being able to use the words hegemony and discourse in your writing will be able to give you the opportunity to give more clarity as to what you're writing and get your point across a bit stronger, so that you can hopefully push towards those excellence grade areas more easily. Cheers, guys. Bye.